Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will be discussing how payment apps support the revolution of digital payment systems. This is the Rockstar Talk session with the topic Innovation through Interconnectivity, supporting Southeast Asia's digital payments revolution through Payments API. This session will be conducted in English. If you need interpretation assistance, we have provided interpretation devices for your convenience located around the interpreter boxes behind you. And this session will be moderated by Mr. Aldi Haryopratomo, serving as the Vice Chairman too of IFSE. Allow me to briefly read his profile. Bapak Aldi Haryopratomo is Vice Chairman too of the Indonesia Fintech Association IFSE, also Vice Chair of Entrepreneurship at the Indonesia Chamber of Commerce and Industry, KADIN, Commissioner at Halodoc, eFishery and KitaBisa.com, as well as founder and former CEO at GoPay. Bapak Aldi holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. To Mr. Aldi Haryopratomo, the stage is yours. Let's give a big round of applause.
Hello, good afternoon everybody. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, so this is an afternoon session, so I think we have our next speaker, I'm sure will keep you all awake. So today, in this today's session, we want to bring you somebody from a global perspective, because I think a lot of the sessions today have been about Indonesia. But every year, we have a speaker that comes and gives us a perspective that's more global than what we see here. And the theme of the session is innovation through connectivity. One of the key parts of financial innovation is payments. Not just payments on the front end for the user, but on the back end. Because what all of the services that we're building is based on is the connections from the apps and the banks and the companies that use the pipes that move the money from A to B. So today we'll have and call to the stage Mr. Krishnan from Stripe. He's the head of global expansion and incubation from Stripe, and he has 20 years of experience in tech and media. We were just talking about today how we have a common background in the media industry, and how hopefully someday we can actually have more media companies connected to our payment rails, right? So he worked in Netflix JPAC before Stripe, plus ANZ, as well as he's the co-founder and chief content and distribution officer of Hook. Krishnan, please come on board, man. Cool. You have the interpreter if anybody asks questions later on. But yeah, have a seat. Okay. So I think we'll actually start this session by allowing Krishnan to actually speak and present for us about what you want to share with regards to the topic of innovation and payments.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Can I use the podium?
Yeah, you can.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's absolutely an honor and privilege to be here. Thanks a lot, Pak Aldi and AFTEC for the invite. Here to talk about opportunities and challenges in regional innovation here in Southeast Asia. Just wanted to start with a few slides about Stripe, which some of you may know about, but I wanted to highlight a few key principles that have served us well. Stripe is a global company. We are headquartered in the US. And we have a lot of well-known users, but actually we are known best for servicing the needs of the small and medium enterprises in ways that haven't been possible before, right? These segments are generally not supported by financial institutions, and Stripe was unique in starting out its journey by wanting to support the needs of small and medium companies, not the large users. So we have a host of products. The website has it all, so I'm not going to go through that. I just wanted to highlight that a key principle that we have is that payments is a really core rail that everything, all the innovation actually sits on top of payments. And the way we've built our product stack is that the core capabilities around being able to receive money, being able to pay out money, and making sure that the safety surrounding the risk and compliance around those activities are the foundational element of everything that Stripe does. So cross-border is another really interesting element of our strategy. We focus extremely heavily on cross-border and trying to make commerce truly cross-border and global. We spend a lot of cycles thinking about the tech and developer community to drive innovation. But as the keynote speaker earlier today pointed out, that's not enough. Tech is not enough. So we work very hard to find the right balance between risk and compliance on one hand and innovation and pace and velocity sort of on the other side. So enough about Stripe. We just wanted to spend a few cycles talking about ASEAN, Southeast Asia. By now it's clear to everybody that APAC leads the way in innovation in fintech, right? Whether it's payments, whether it's digital financial services, whether it's new innovative use cases, whether it's interoperability models, I think the action is here in Southeast Asia, and I think it's an absolutely amazing time to be in Southeast Asia, in tech, right, at this point in time. So it's really exciting times. All of you have seen the market data about how big this opportunity is. ASEAN is already, in 2022, the 5th largest economy, if you treat it as a single economy, from a GDP perspective. And the interesting thing is it's growing much faster than any other cluster, right? So this is going to be by far the largest part of the world in terms of GDP growth and innovation over the next decade. Now, as you think about how this translates to daily activity, a lot of this volume and growth is domestic. So Indonesian businesses for Indonesia, etc. But cross-border is increasingly important as a strategy. Not just the big tech giants, but even smaller and medium enterprises, the very first thing they think about as they think about global expansion is to try and figure out if they can sell within Southeast Asia, right? So it's a very common and natural first part of a global journey. And so we think about Southeast Asia as a regional cluster, as a really important enabler of growth. Key challenges and friction. So Pak Aldi had said, talk about some challenges. I mean, obviously everyone knows what the opportunity is. It's all about how do you actually make this work. Couple of key challenges we've seen, right? One, risk and compliance models for domestic small and medium businesses, but also for consumers, right? I think the previous sessions talked about lending and it talked about unbanked populations. So it is very real that the infrastructure to understand these types of users and these types of consumers is missing, right? Is still in the early stages. So there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen, and a lot of new services I think will come up to support this innovation in the space. Onboarding is another good example, right? Onboarding is a phrase we use as to how we decide whether or not to support the needs of a merchant who wants to sell online or offline. Now, obviously, there's a lot of challenges in trying to verify the credentials and make sure this is actually a legitimate merchant. And it is because of regulations and other needs that are important, it makes it really hard for the for smaller, medium, and sort of medium enterprises in particular to come online. And so that's kind of an interesting challenge that we've seen as one of the hurdles in growing and scaling online. The other thing that's interesting is the regulatory frameworks across all the markets are just a little bit different from each other, right? So this makes it increasingly, whether it's talking about data localization, talking about compliance rules, onboarding rules, AML rules, there's a whole bunch of elements of what is the underlying rail. Because the differences exist, what it does is, if a merchant in a market, let's say a gaming studio in Indonesia wants to now expand into Malaysia, it is non-trivial for them to try and establish a presence, to get onboarded and to be able to make money by selling to consumers in Malaysia, right? So the first hurdle that SMEs face is domestic. they hit a certain level of growth, and then they look at expansion, and then they face many more challenges trying to operate in a new market context. And they have to change a bunch of their processes, controls, systems, tools, and so that's the hurdle that we think is important to eliminate to help unlock growth. So, which is a good segue to like what are the different models for unlocking growth. Obviously, private partnerships work, but I think governments and regulators have a very important role to play in this space. You know, DEFA, I think we are very hopeful and optimistic that the DEFA initiative that's going on within ASEAN will address a lot of these specific issues. So I'm not much of a regulator. I don't know the context very well, but I just wanted to say that we've been tracking and are very optimistic that this will be a foundational work stream for a lot of other work that needs to happen. The last few minutes, I just wanted to talk about, from a Stripe perspective and learnings, what are some other things we can bring to the table to help accelerate this growth further. So there are some principles that we've actually used globally. The very first idea is this idea that payment rails and money movement infrastructure has to be a foundational piece, right? We should almost think about this as important as electricity or the internet. It's a fundamental utility. It has to just perform, and it has to be available for all the other kinds of use cases that you want to build on top. So we've designed our systems to do it, and I think this is going to be a really important element for any business of the future to think about as they think about monetization. Ubiquity. This is another really important piece, which is starting to think about global or at least regional from the get-go, right? Like not building systems, products, etc., to work in ways that are limited to one market. And one example of this is the way we do payment systems, is we actually make sure that everything we do, if a merchant signs up and accepts a payment method like GoPay, that they would actually, any merchant in the world should be able to use GoPay, right? Not just merchants in Indonesia. So it's a principle, not that we get it right all the time, but it's an element of like having a platform as opposed to a feature. So it's an important sort of consideration. Finally, reliability, I think we just talked about. I think this is as foundational, we believe, as electricity or the internet. So it just has to work. And finally, I think this is an element of experience from a merchant perspective, which is once you go through the process to get onboarded, you shouldn't have to do anything more, right? Like, so you should actually provide a consolidated experience across all the different flavors of requirements so that the merchants can immediately start monetizing, right? The goal is to focus and help the merchants monetize as quickly as possible. Last thing, this is, and this cannot be understated at all, risk and compliance is so critical to get right because you lose trust when you have fraud attacks or disputes and so forth. And so the system is only as good as how clean it is. And so we spend as much cycles thinking about innovation as we think about safety and controls in this ecosystem. So with that, I'll just, that was a quick sort of summary of Stripe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was brief, but very comprehensive, actually. So my first question, actually, because a lot of the audience here are actually fintech entrepreneurs, right? And one of the challenges that everybody faces in fintech is balancing between innovation, which sometimes means you go into murky areas, and actually like compliance, right? So how do you, this slide is there for a reason. Like, how do you guys balance that? What are some of the trade-offs that you had to make sure that you were on the right side of the law?
Yeah, no, I think the starting point for us is like we always have to be on the right side of the law, right? I don't think it's a negotiable outcome. And so the way to flip that question is to think about how do you iterate your product and innovate in a way, because there are edge cases, and often I think there are ways to approach the problem where you're pushing the envelope in a understood way of form of risk, right? So it's the shape of risk matters, not just the fact that you're taking risk. And so the way we've been thinking about it is thinking about product features that are, especially in gray areas, that you sort of want to iterate into, you want to fail fast into. You certainly want to work closely with regulators. You want to make sure that the ecosystem understands. And it's not just the regulators, it's our partners, financial institutions. We rely very heavily on banks and others, the networks as well for our underlying infra. And so part of the journey for us is we need to pull everyone along, right? Like I think it's going to be hard for an entrepreneur to like kind of break the rules and then ask for forgiveness. We don't believe that's the right model for anyone actually. And you may get some short-term gains, but I think there'll be a lot more pain in the long term if you don't do that. So to flip the question, I think we need to work with regulators and partners in the financial industry to incrementally and iterate out of this as opposed to try dramatic disruptive moves, which I think will probably not work.
Yeah, it makes sense. Actually, I think, I mean, a lot of the people in fintech come from other sectors, right? But fintech itself is not only the regulators that you have to care about, but actually you mentioned something important, which is actually the stakeholders. That's right. Because ultimately you have to be connected to rails, which are banks, who actually care about regulation, right? So, makes sense. Okay, but then another issue is that regulation across different countries is also different. Yes. Right? When I was, building my own fintech, we had Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. They're all different. Yep. Like, what do you think are some of the issues or challenges that you found operating in the region, and what is something that you wish had happened already?
No, I think that challenge is real, right? Like, there's a reason there are not that many payment companies that are present in all the markets in Southeast Asia, right? It is incredibly hard. It's very challenging. The environments are all very different. And if you want to play by the rules, you have to invest 3 to 4 years of licensing and product development to meet the local requirements, right? Now, if I had to sort of wave a wand and say, like, what is my wish list? I would love for harmonized regulations that, at least at the regional clusters, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, whatever definition you choose, to harmonize this, because the goal is to enable growth and support growth while attacking the bad actors. And there doesn't have to be 20 different ways to write the rules, right? Like, as long as the intent is clear, there may be a path to harmonize regulations. And I think that would be a massive accelerant to growth in the region.
Okay, so harmonizing regulation, I think that's a big word. Let's kind of break it down, right? So when you harmonize something, it means that all the regulators or the countries have to follow a certain kind of way of doing things, right? Yep. And so then we have to look at the markets that have actually succeeded in the regulation. Yep. So if you had to pick, right, like what are some of the specific markets and regulation that we could probably draw upon for Indonesia in any part of fintech that you want to?
Yeah. No, I would say that I think the focus should be on the principles, not the actual rules, right? Because I think the rules have to be built for Southeast Asia by Southeast Asia, right? I don't think you can copy like the regulations, but the frameworks, I think EU is a great example of like a number of different countries like collaborating together to agree on certain rules that is good enough, right? If you think about like the conversations that, I'm not privy to it, but I'm assuming take place within the EU forum, it's every country trying to represent their interests and then the common good sort of winning. I think that kind of framework, because ultimately the requirements are not that different, right? Like if you think about what do you have to do to set up like a strong compliance and risk control framework, you really need to know that like the merchants are legitimate merchants. You need to make sure that the consumers, are using legitimate payment instruments and that they're authorizing. So that actually the requirements at that level are exactly the same. So the hows are what I think right now are very divergent. And so I'm an optimist by heart, and I do think there are opportunities for regulators to get together and sort of solve this. Another good example of this actually working is interoperability of QR is would have been very hard to imagine just 2 years back, right? But today, if you look at QRIS and you look at SGQR Plus and you think about all these interoperability models, those regulators did get together and did agree that these are the common rules, and not just the common rules, but also common product specs, because this QR now carries like the payload of like a number of different payment methods and knows how, so that each app just works, right? So there are signals of success here, and I think we just need to build on that.
Yeah, you're right, actually, because even not only that, even QRIS.
Yeah, it's fantastic, right?
Running here was actually not easy. It was one of the first places where you're able to create that kind of standard, like India being another one.
That's right.
Right? how about any examples from like other countries, like in South America or in Europe, that you've seen to be interesting?
Yeah, no, I think South America, I think, is somewhat similar to Southeast Asia, and it's still early days. And I see we do see a lot of similar challenges in what I'll call. I think it's wrong to use the word emerging markets. I think we're well past that stage.
Yeah.
But the payments infrastructure is still emerging. Let's just say, right? So I think that's definitely sort of a common element. I would point to India as an interesting example where the regulator is standardizing regulations. This is just a domestic thing. But when you have a number of different regimes, regulatory regimes within a country, one covering payments, another covering lending, another covering digital financial services, etc. As an example, they all had different versions of KYC, KYB, right? And so the rules were just a little bit different. And so if you wanted to do payments, you had to do KYC, KYB a certain way. And then if you wanted to do lending, it's different. And the user you onboarded, you can't lend to anymore. And so, so creating like a layering framework for regulations, like for instance, having common KYB definition, which is like basically is standard risk controls and compliance controls, as a separate like set of rules that everyone refers to, is a good example of layering, right? So just like we layer systems, I think it would be really interesting to layer regulations as well to cover aspects of regulation, right? If things that cover like a merchant identity, like everybody should be using the same set of rules so that we can that's one version of sort of harmonizing like within a country, for example, right? So,
yeah, it makes sense actually. So I think the way that you can think about harmonizing regulations across even different countries is actually to dissect it.
That's
right. So the same way that you said KYB in Indonesia and Philippines, eventually you can harmonize it because that's less contentious compared to some of the more like nitty-gritty that's specific to each country. Right. I think in terms of like Stripe itself, right? How do you see the role of Stripe in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, no, I think the first thing I'll say is, you know, Stripe wants to, right, so one of the words that was thrown about quite a lot today, I think, was disruption, right? And I think we are anti-disruption, right? Like, we don't believe in disruption as an end goal. And so the way we think about it is, we have a number of products and features that are interesting and different and differentiated. We do think that there are lots of local companies that have a lot more market knowledge, a lot more context, etc. And so we think about collaboration and partnerships as really critical to get this right. And so it would be hubris to imagine that an MNC can just enter a market the size and impact of Indonesia and by itself succeed and win, right? I think that is, those days are gone. I think the markets are so unique and so bespoke. I really think about collaborations and partnerships, not just with the private industry, but also with the regulators in the market is super critical. I think Stripe aspires to be local. We want to ultimately be an Indonesian company as well, and be an Indian company, and be a British company, and just so happen to be headquartered in the US, as opposed to being known as a US company, right? Like, I think that's the aspiration for literally any MNC that needs to succeed in these markets.
Got it. Yeah, I think we're out of time, right? But thank you very much. I think the conclusion for this panel is that I think it's really, really important, actually, for us to figure out how do we de-layer the different parts of regulation so that you can pick the components that everybody can agree on, and then make that a standard first in-country, like KYB, and then ideally a standard across different countries.
That's right.
And one of the ways to enable this is actually to have a player like Stripe, like what Visa did in the payment sector, right, as well, to be somebody that can see the global perspective working with the local partner. Okay. Thank you very much, Krishnan, for your time. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was insightful. Have a good afternoon.
All right. Thanks. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aldi, Haryopratomo, and Mr. Krishnan Rajagopalan for the Rockstar Talk today. Let's give a big round of applause for our panelists today, everybody.